Oh, first of all, I want to say good evening to everybody, and want to welcome you to the James Connolly Forum. And our topic today is the invention of the white race. And we have a dynamic speaker who's been, since I just met today, y'all. But he's been telling me, Willie, you in for a treat. I got some things that you see, you in for a treat. So I'm taking him up on there. And in saying that, I'm gonna keep his bowels short so he can get more in. But before we begin, there's one thing, you know, when we have forums, a lot of times people have announcements at the end, but a lot of people can get up and shout out the door. And some of these announcements are kind of important. So what I want to do first is, you know, just go through some announcements, you know, so that the people here hear all the good announcements, good things, because I know you want to go to a lot of things. You don't want to just come here, you want to broaden your mind. So we're going to open up there. Is there any announcements?
It's Friday night. I made a pot of real tea that we sell. Thank you.
First, I just want to say that you know, a lot of people here. Before we came here, we had a good meal over at was it Alabama? We sit down, real good meal, and we asked for the doggy bag. We didn't leave nothing, you know. And I want to say that that's a meal. Now, when we come to the forums here, this is like a meal too, right? Because we're feeding your mind.
That's right.
Right? And when we feed the mind, we're not doing it just to feed the mind. Like you're not, you know, you're not just eating to eat. You're eating to keep your body up so you can do things like that. But well, we feeding our mind, get knowledge, so that we know. So a lot of us here, we're organizers, revolutionaries, socialists, or whatever. You know, we're going out and we're about organizing. We're about building a movement, right? I hope that was about getting this information. So when we get this information, we get this information so that we can use to do those things. So tonight, Jeffrey Perry got a lot of books over here. So that's why I'm saying I'm looking at that. So there's a lot, must be a lot of information in this mind right here, and you can do all that. So I don't want to hold up, but I just want to say that, you know, we going to absorb all the information that you could give us tonight. And as soon as, you know, I get to speaking and introduce you, I'm going right out there and sit, and I'm looking forward to it. Just to say a short thing about Jeffrey, he told me to be short, and I'm going to take him up on that. Jeffrey B. Perry is an independent working class scholar, formerly educated at Princeton, Harvard, Rutgers, and Columbia. Oh, I can see why you got all them books now. His work focused on the role of white supremacists as a retardant to progressive social change and on the centrality of the struggle against white supremacy to progressive social change. For over 35 years, he has been active in the working class movement as a rank and file worker and as a union shop steward, officer, editor, and he's retired. So he can do more now. All right, because we all look forward to that. So without further ado, I want to bring Jeff to the forefront to give us food for thought.
I'd like to thank Willie very much, and John and everyone. I had dinner with some people earlier. It's a wonderful crowd. I got to meet some of the people. I'm very impressed by the turnout and by the quality of the turnout, and I mean that, talking with some people. And I want you to know, when Verso heard, I mentioned this to John, that I would be speaking at the John Connolly Forum in Troy, New York. They were utterly thrilled. They consider it one of the most prestigious speaking engagements in the country. So feel proud. We're going to get right into this, if that's okay. I'm going to step over there in a second, but I did work for a union, did a lot of union work for many years, so I'll project. But I write about two people, Hubert Harrison, 1883 to 1927, and Theodore W. Allen, 1919 to 2005. They are both autodidactic, that's self-educated, anti-white supremacist, working class intellectuals. They are two of the very most important thinkers on race and class in 20th century America, and most people have not heard about either one. So we're going to start, everybody can hear me, right? We're going to start with Hubert Harrison. And we have over there, well, I'll get into these, but Hubert Harrison, as I said, he's a brilliant intellectual, he's race and class conscious, he's a self-defined radical internationalist. He is described by A. Philip Randolph as the father of Harlem radicalism in a period when Harlem is considered the center of radical black thought and the international Negro Mecca. He is a freethinker. He's the leading black activist in the Socialist Party until he leaves. He's the founder of the New Negro Movement. He's the first regular black book reviewer in Negro newspaperdom, was his phrase. He is the major radical influence on A. Philip Randolph and Marcus Garvey, that's the class, and the race radicals, that's Martin and Malcolm, when we grow up, right? He is a total giant of black history, and 100 years and 4 months ago, he was right in this area, touring New York State for the Socialist Party, getting arrested in Buffalo, in free speech struggles, speaking in Albany and a host of other places throughout the state, 23 talks a week for the Socialist Party, 40,000 heard him at Union Square on May Day, 3 hours according to the New York Times. He kept a rapt audience as far as the voice could go, speaking at Wall and Broad Streets in Lower Manhattan in front of the Stock Exchange on socialism. And I mean, he pioneers the tradition of soapbox oratory that's picked up by Randolph and Garvey and Malcolm much later. A total giant. We have over there, this is volume 1 of a 2-volume biography. One other thing, J.A. Rogers considers Harrison the foremost Afro-American intellect of his era. That's amidst chapters on Booker T, Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and Martin, William Monroe Trotter, excuse me. So he's a total giant in black history. This is volume 1 of a 2-volume biography, Columbia University Press, 600 pages, first multi-volume biography of an Afro-Caribbean, only the 5th of an African-American, after those of Booker T, Du Bois, Langston Hughes, and Martin Luther King Jr. 610 pages, 116 pages of notes, 60 pages, detailed captions, reviews, Cornel West, Arnold Rampersand, David Levering Lewis, Manning Marable, etc., etc. If you go to my webpage, you can read all of this stuff. You'll be shocked by what you read on how important people recognize him to be and how little we have known about him. This is Columbia University Press, this is Wesleyan University Press, this is 137 of his 700 writings. I was able to track down his family some years ago, and they had preserved all his writings since 1927. The game plan is to put all 700 writings on the web, permanent searchable database, Columbia University Rare Book and Manuscript Library, for free. Not getting paid for any of this. Independent scholars don't get paid. Then we'll get into Harrison. But going on with Harrison now. So you've had a brief little intro to Harrison. Let me turn this on, my presenter. This is the biography. That's the reader. Here's my webpage. It's simply my name. I really encourage people to go there. All kinds of free stuff. JeffreyBPerry.net. Harrison arrives in New York City. I'm going to use Harrison to offer a brief introduction because he opens the door for Allen and the invention of the white race. When Harrison arrives in New York City in 1900, he encountered, from St. Croix, he's born in St. Croix, Virgin Islands. U.S. doesn't purchase Virgin Islands until 1917, so it's a Danish colony, right? He encounters a vicious white supremacy unlike anything he knew before. He and other Afro-Caribbeans, particularly from the English-speaking islands, commented on this vicious white supremacy they encountered here. Marcus Garvey comments on it, Claude McKay, and they often commented on the difference between the U.S. and their homelands. Hubert Harrison was utterly shocked, particularly by lynching, which he encounters when he comes here. Claude McKay phrases it particularly well, I think. He writes, when he came to the U.S., it was the first time I had ever come face to face with such manifest, implacable hatred of my race, and my feelings were indescribable. I had heard of race prejudice in America, but never dreamed of it being so intensely bitter. The point I'm trying to make is it's qualitatively different between the Anglo-Caribbean and the U.S. I'm going to explain why.
Here's the year that Harrison arrived. This is 4 men at one time. I was just down in Atlanta doing about 8 talks. And this is 4 black men at one time. That year, at least 107 were lynched in that one year. And lynching was unknown in St. Croix, where Harrison comes from. So in describing the difference between the Anglo-Caribbean and the U.S., I'm going to use St. Croix, which I'm most familiar with, but what I'm saying also applies in general for Jamaica and Barbados, places like that, right? In St. Croix, there is no history of lynch terror. This is when Harrison's growing up. No formal segregation. Class promotion among a sector of the people of African descent was fostered. Harrison was actually born on a plantation that was owned by 2 men of color. If you can contrast that with the U.S., you would rarely find that, right? Probably, virtually never. White supremacy was not as virulent or as organized as in the U.S. Here's in brief why this was the case. In St. Croix, the population in St. Croix was in the 20,000s in this period. Of that population, 5% was European descent, primarily of the upper classes. 80% of the population was black, plantation laborers. 15% so-called colored, of mixed European and African ancestry. The greatly outnumbered European on top of the society couldn't control the 95% very easily, so they sought to utilize the 15% to help. And that works for a while, but when push comes to shove in St. Croix, as in Haiti and elsewhere, the free colored sided with the black plantation laborers and led to emancipation victory in the 1840s. During slavery, and now here's the contrast. During slavery, in St. Croix, there was a policy of promotion and landholding for a sector of the African-descended population. Actual laws passed implementing this, right? Free coloreds served in the militia. That's the principal instrument of social control on this island. They made up a major component of it. And in 1834, a law was passed in St. Croix. A law, an edict of full equality, which at least nominally granted full equality between white Europeans and free coloreds, right? In contrast, in the U.S. in the same period, the general policy was one of severe racial proscriptions for all African Americans. We're going to get into this in Alan's work. Slave patrols, the principal instrument of social control, were lily white by definition, as opposed to being composed of free coloreds. And the law, rather than an edict of full equality, was the Dred Scott decision, which said no black person had any rights that a white was bound to respect. All right, that's a little bit of the background. I want to make the point, and I hope you get clear, there's a qualitative difference in how social control is maintained in the Anglo-Caribbean. In St. Croix, they spoke English. That was the primary language, right? Even though Dutch, Danish ancestry or history. This is Harrison when he's in the Socialist Party. This is the period I was just talking about. He's the leading black activist in the Socialist Party. He writes the first major theoretical pieces by a black activist, major series. One in the New York Call, which is a daily newspaper, and then in the International Socialist Review the following year. It's a series on the Negro and socialism. And in this particular piece in 1911, he writes, and I think this is a very important concept, the touchstone concept. Politically, the Negro is the touchstone of the modern democratic idea. The presence of the Negro puts our democracy to the test and reveals the falsity of it. I think a touchstone is an extraordinary metaphor. A touchstone is a black stone. You rub it against gold to test the purity of the metal. Is it really gold? It's a wonderful metaphor we can use at every issue we look at in society. Housing, education, healthcare, incarceration rate, all of this. Let's put it to the test. How are black people faring? What are we going to do about it? He goes on in that same passage to write, essentially, true democracy and equality implies a revolution startling to even think of. I think that passage foreshadows the 1960s, when the civil rights, black liberation struggle is a catalyst for the anti-war movement, the student movement, the women's movement, gay and lesbian rights movements, all these movements that many of us here were influenced by or part of, right? So again, that's all in one passage. Now I want to move on. He also writes, and this is very profound and very important for Alan's work. He writes in his series in the International Socialist Review, the 10 million Negroes of America form a group that is more essentially proletarian than any other American group, and the Negro was, under slavery, the most thoroughly exploited of the American proletariat, the most thoroughly despised. This is under slavery, right? He's talking about black labor as proletariat. Now, we see that, here's the actual passage, there's Harrison, it's the leading opening paragraph, and you don't have to read all this, but that's where that quote came from. But then we get some years later, we get 24 years later, 23 years later, W.E.B. Du Bois, in his major work, which redoes a lot of how we understand the Civil War and Reconstruction, his major historical contribution, Black Reconstruction, he says the South, after the Civil War, presented the greatest opportunity for a real national labor movement which the nation ever saw or is likely to see for many decades. Yet the labor movement, with few exceptions, never realized. It never had the intelligence to see in black slavery and Reconstruction the kernel and the meaning of the labor movement, right? So this is the point, this understanding of black labor as proletarian. Now I'm going to go quickly over the next 3 slides. Allen takes this analysis, and originally he only knows of Du Bois. Later on he learns of Harrison, because most people didn't know about Harrison when Allen starts writing. But given this understanding of slavery in Anglo-America as capitalism, slaveholders as capitalists, it follows chattel bond laborers were proletarians. He argues that the study of class consciousness that the American workers have of their own class interests must start with recognition of that fact. He's saying by not treating black labor in slave or chattel bond servitude, black laborers who are chattel bond servants, as proletarians, we do several things. We lose some of the most heroic examples of struggle in the history of the working class. We don't tear the covers off as we should from white laborers' betrayal of black labor. But the crucial thing for Allen's work, he says, only by understanding that black labor was, that chattel bond labor was proletarian, are we able to uncover the real origin of this white race thing. All right, now, I just want you to hear that because I'm going to try and explain it in a second. Here's the last quote from Hubert Harrison. He winds up leaving the Socialist Party in 1914, and he has poured his heart out for socialism for a number of years. And there are a number of very definite white supremacist incidents, including, and particularly segregated locals in the South and things like this. And as he leaves the Socialist Party, he offers what I say is arguably the most profound but least heated criticism in the history of the left. And that's why I think it's unfortunate that we didn't know about Harrison for many years. But he states simply, the Socialist Party, like the labor movement, has insisted on white race first and class after, that it put the white race first before class. I think that brings us directly to the question, what is this white race thing, right? So now we're going to get into Allen. This is Allen probably in the 1960s when he's about ready to start on his long journey of writing on the invention of the white race. Allen's a working class intellectual activist. Harrison, by the way, as I said, J.A. Rogers considers him the foremost Afro-American intellect. Besides all his literary achievements and his writings and stuff, Harrison self-educated 6 languages. He spoke 6 languages, including teaching himself Arabic and reading the Quran, not because he was religious, because it's the religion of so many people of African descent. Allen is also a brilliant, it is said that he went to college for 1 day, but he left because he found it too confining, right? He's a working class intellectual activist. He's a former coal miner. He was a local president of 3 UMW locals in the late 30s, early 40s in West Virginia. After he hurts his back in the mines, he's a factory worker, teacher, postal worker, as was Harrison, as was I. We're all postal workers, right? And librarian. Allen is the originator of the white skin privilege concept. People may have heard of that concept. They associate it with Peggy McIntosh, David Roediger, 1986-87. It starts 20 years earlier with Allen in race and class analysis, far different than what comes forth later. Qualitatively different. And what people may or may not know, people in this crowd may remember, but in 1969, the New York Times was running a major article on Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, talking about how SDS's national office was calling for an all-out national campaign against white privilege, white skin privilege, right? So some people know that history, but other people think it all starts with the invisible knapsack and things like that. So Allen originates that concept in '65. He writes a whole series of things. On my webpage, I have a lot of these pamphlets. You know, you can go to them, white blind spot, can white workers be white workers crossed out, can white radicals be radicalized, right? And he writes this pamphlet in '74, '75. It starts as a presentation at Yale at the IRPE, the Union of Radical Political Economists Conference. We put it out in pamphlet form, and now it's been reissued by the SUNY Stony Brook Center for Study of Working Class Life, right? And it's available there. It's available free on my webpage, so if you don't have your $3, get it for free on the webpage. And his magnum opus, his life's work is this, The Invention of the White Race, 2 volumes, 1994, 1997 by Verso. Here's my webpage again. Here's some of Alan's other writings that I just mentioned. I want to call your attention for the historians in the crowd. It's a devastating critique of Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom, if people are familiar with that. And it's a devastating critique of David Roediger. And none of them are mean-spirited. I mean, it's all very principled, but I leave you to read and judge for yourself, right? But you'll find the links to all of these on the webpage. This one was on a journal called Cultural Logic. This was in Monthly Review. And these are just samples of some of the topics he writes on. On my webpage, on the opening page, I have this article, which goes through Harrison and Allen in great depth, over 80 pages, the development of the analysis of his thought. The story behind it is it starts out as a requested 2,500-page piece for a journal called Daedalus, not one of my regular readings, right? But then they asked me to double it, and it winds up turning into 117 pages. But it's there on the website, and it goes through statistics of the current crisis. It goes through Allen and Harrison. I think people will find it, if you're interested in this stuff, you'll find it of great interest. Okay, here's what Allen writes on the back cover of Volume 1 in 1994 when the book first comes out. Volume 1, they come out 3 years apart. When the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, there were no white people there, nor would there be for another 60 years. He bases this on going through 885 county years of Virginia colonial records. These are primary records. I have them all at my house now because I have all his papers, as I had all of Harrison's papers. And Allen spent 20 years going through all these records, and what he was doing is he had a keen eye because he's a working class person, right? This is what I call good proletarian scholarship. And he's looking through these primary records wherever laboring people, men, women, European American, African American, had a voice in a hearing or something. And he would transcribe, he would write these all down, then come back at night and type them up, you know, and so it's over 1,000 pages of his transcriptions also, right? And the word white doesn't appear in any Virginia colonial record till 1691. But it's not simply a matter of semantics. It's not simply that the word doesn't appear. He argues very effectively, I think, that the white race as we know it was not functioning. Here's another example. And what he writes, he goes on to say, amongst other things, others living in the colony at the time were English. They'd been English when they left England, and they and their Virginia-born children were English. They were not white. White identity had to be carefully taught, and it would be another 60 years, right? 1640, I want to drive this point home a little more. People may remember 7 months ago, Ancestry.com came out with this little piece on Barack Obama being related to a person who was sentenced to lifetime bond servitude here in the United States, a fellow named John Punch, an African-American. What the interesting twist on it was John Punch was related to Barack Obama on his mother's side, right? And when some people may have seen it, when that article came out, this is the only known recorded document pertaining to John Punch. And John Punch escapes, he's a limited term bond servant, right? And he escapes with 2 cohorts. Victor, a Dutchman, and the other a Scotchman called James Gregory. As you can see, they're still not white, right? This is 1640. Here's the big one, Bacon's Rebellion. We have some students of Bacon's Rebellion in the crowd here. But Bacon's Rebellion, we'll go into this more, but in Bacon's Rebellion, in the second Civil War stage, people at the bottom of society in Virginia, and Allen focuses on Virginia. Virginia is the pattern-setting colony. 7 of the first 12 presidents come from Virginia. It's, you know, it's driving the ship as far as setting up the patterns of race that are going to prevail in this country, originally in the South and in this country. And in Bacon's Rebellion, in the second Civil War stage, 1676 into January 1677, the people at the bottom of society, particularly bond laborers, right, kick out the governor. They burn Jamestown. The governor has to flee. They control 6/7 of the land for 9 months. If you remember, how many years? I'm getting old now. 15 years ago, the Falklands crisis, maybe it was longer. It took 14 days to get those boats from England. Imagine back a few centuries, it took 2.5 months, you know, to get boats over. So in Bacon's Rebellion, this is the account by Captain Thomas Grantham, who's sent to put down the insurrection. You don't have to read all the words. I've tried to highlight, and I'll try and call your attention to what's key. But Grantham talks about, as he's going to put down the rebellion, there's a lot of deceit and treachery involved. But I there met 400 English and Negroes in arms. Some were for shooting me, others were for cutting me in pieces. I told them that they were all pardoned and freed from their slavery, except about, and then in the final stages, 80 Negroes and 20 English would not deliver their arms. Still not white, clearly not white, right? With that, you wouldn't see such solidarity for the next few hundred years down south. Here are the three main theses of Allen's invention of the white race. The white race was invented as a ruling class social control formation in response to labor solidarity as manifested in the latter Civil War stages of Bacon's Rebellion. I'm laying out the thesis because we're going to come back to it, but a lawyer friend says, oh, this is a good thing to do early. A system of racial privileges was deliberately instituted by the late 17th century, 18th century Anglo-American bourgeoisie in order to define and establish the white race and establish a system of racial oppression. Allen is quite precise with his words. We're going to talk about what he means by racial oppression. What I want to call your attention to, it's as a social control formation. This is the lingo in the academy since the late 1990s. Race is a social construct. Allen says that's not enough. If you just say that, you leave the door open for all kinds of biogenetic theses, cultural dysfunction theses. He lays it clearly on the ruling class. He's talking about the invention of the white race in terms of class, as an aspect of the class struggle. His third and very pivotal thesis is that the consequence of the invention of the white race and of this system of race privileges was ruinous to the interest of African Americans, but was also disastrous for European American workers. And this is what distinguishes Allen's work from a lot of that stuff that comes later in the 1980s. But way back, even in my generation, so when some people were picking up on it, some people, for instance, weather people and things like that, didn't grasp Allen, who's arguing this, this is a class issue, and it's not in their interest, and they kind of gave up on working people, right? Allen never gives up on working people. He's there trying to bring home these important messages. Allen's main theses contend that European American workers' position vis-a-vis the rich and powerful was not improved but weakened by the white skin privilege system, and the invention of the white race was political and no part of genetic evolution. I just want to say, on this topic right here, in that long piece I have, Developing Conjuncture, I put some numbers to show how today we're not doing well, because of this system, and I use a lot of comparative studies too between U.S. workers and European workers and things like that. Here's the history of Allen's book. This is how he comes. Now, Allen, after he hurts his mind, he comes up and he joins the Communist Party when he's 17 down in West Virginia in the coal mines. Depression, right? And he's active with the Communist Party, but he's in it, but not totally of it, right? And he teaches at the Jefferson School Marxist economics for quite a number of years until he splits in the 50s after the Khrushchev revelations, things like this. And but he's got this training, so he loves to read history, and he's well versed in Marxist economics. So he knows this stuff very well, right? So here's what happens. It's in the 60s. And he's fascinated with history, and most people in this audience, I think, can relate to a lot that I'm going to say here. He has an identification with the ordinary people, a moral conviction that racial discrimination is a bad thing. The atmosphere was changed in the 60s due to the war. Primarily, he highlights the African-American civil rights struggle, the peace movement, SDS, and he began to ponder the question, could it be possible that the key defeats suffered by the democratic, progressive, populist, and socialist movements in the history of this country was to be attributed to the infection of white supremacism? He wants to look at white supremacy as a principal reason for the failures of the left in this country. He draws from Du Bois at this point, had planted the seed for such a general review with Black Reconstruction in 35. So around 1965, he sets out to investigate three great crises in U.S. history. I think we're entering the fourth now, so these are particularly important. And the crises he's going to look at are those of the 1870s, the Panic of 1873, Civil War, Reconstruction period, 1890s, Depression, and the populist period, and then the 1930s. We've all some familiarity with those things. And that's the three crises he's going to look at. Here's what he finds, and this is a major work, but a lot of his stuff is still unpublished, and you know, the task is going to be to get all this out. But he finds, and this is a 172-page paper he had, in three periods of national crisis, characterized by general confrontation between capital and urban and rural laboring classes, key to defeat of the forces of democracy, labor, and socialism was in each case achieved by ruling class appeals to white supremacism. Now, if that's true, that's very important for us today. I mean, if we're going to learn some lessons from history. So I'm not going to go through all three, we're moving swiftly, as John suggested, but I'm going to just briefly talk about the Great Depression. A fellow at Columbia named Ira Katznelson has written a book, When Affirmative Action Was White. Katznelson makes the point that each and every federal program, no exception, from the 1930s into the 60s was shaped in a white supremacist fashion. In brief, that troika of support that FDR built was tied, one of the key legs was that Southern Dixiecrats, right? And they were playing a real role in shaping all this. So I come out of the labor movement, many here involved in the labor movement. If we look at the major labor legislation coming out of the New Deal, the National Labor Relations Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and Social Security until 1951 all excluded domestic and agricultural workers. 75% of your black and Latin workforce down south, maybe 65% nationwide. Relief, federal monies controlled locally down south, it meant great disparities. GI Bill, and this one strikes home to me because I live right outside the city and I'm born in the Bronx, right? The GI Bill, people here probably know, under the GI Bill you can get a home with zero down payment, low interest loan. Statistics for the GI Bill were, for New York, North Jersey area, 67,000 mortgages were awarded, less than 100 go to families of color. That's how you get the ring of lily white suburbs around New York and every other city in this country. Here's the last one, and we have labor people here, and this is one that most labor people don't know, and I didn't know until I came on this. This one is staggering to me. The black to white unemployment ratio was 1 to 1 in 29. As long as anybody in this room, I venture to say, has been alive, it's been 2 to 1 or some variant of it. Black to white unemployment ratio. That's all we've known. We take it for granted almost, right? It was 1 to 1 at the start of the Depression. And if you think about it, it makes sense because black people were brought here to work, right? So it would make sense that they would be employed. But after those New Deal programs, the post-war, you know, resetting up of the labor situation, by 1947, it's 2 to 1, and that's what it's been ever since, right? So, just so we're making, so this is how the white supremacist response to these crises when people start coming together. This is some of the arguments that Alan's making. So Alan goes so far as to venture, he offers a little schema, how we can interpret some of this. So he says, we may be able to look at the history of class struggle in the U.S. as a 5-stage cycle. Normal course of capital events brings on a deterioration condition of workers. Substance of the white workers' privileges at a certain point starts to become deteriorated a little. We saw a little of this maybe in Occupy, right? A little awakening on that. White workers start to talk more of class unity. You know, let's get together. We've got much in common, class issues, and there's more or less efforts to make common cause with black proletarians against capital. What Alan argues is, unfortunately, historically, this part is not unfortunate, we can expect them to do it, the bourgeoisie moves to resubstantiate the race privileges of the white workers, and then what has traditionally happened is the white workers have taken the bait, broken solidarity with the black workers. This is the little schema he offers in a 1974 article. Alan argues that the white race has served as the principal historic guarantor of ruling class domination in this country. Now we're going to get into what this white race thing is in brief and how it gets set up. Going back now to Alan's history of his book. He starts out in the 60s, and I explained to you what he's doing, and he's looking at these 3 crises. But what happens is a book comes out by a fellow named Winthrop D. Jordan. It wins the National Book Award. The book title is White Over Black, American Attitudes Towards the Negro, 1550 to 1812. You can see by the title, Jordan equates white with American, right? And what Jordan's basically arguing is that racism is an unthinking decision, that racism is innate. That's the core of Jordan's argument. And if racism is innate, the implication is why fight it, right? And so Allen's very clear what the implications of Jordan's book are. So he's writing this history, and when Allen's writing the history of those crises, there's another part to that argument, which I don't throw on all the slides, but this group I think people will be a little familiar. He also goes through the histories of the US left, trying to explain why the relatively low level of class consciousness in this country compared to other, and he goes through Engels, Sorga, Foster, and so on. Socialist Party scholars, the Beards, you know, historians, Commons, Perlman, all these people. He goes through them all, and he says they essentially argue a six-pronged rationale, which he elaborates, and in my Developing Conjuncture article, anyone wants to look at it. A six-pronged rationale: heterogeneity of the labor force, relative social mobility, development of a trade union bureaucracy before a labor movement, you know, things like this. And he says each and every one of these six-pronged rationale has to be reassessed in light of white supremacy, and basically they don't hold, right? That's what he argues, freelance safety valve. So you might, particularly labor historians in the group, you might want to look at that. I summarize, but I point to where you can see the original documents. So Allen's writing that book, but Jordan comes out with this. So as Allen says, this leads him back. If racism, he's got to take on Morgan's argument. He feels that's what he's got to do. You with me so far on this, right? Okay.
Jordan's argument.
Yeah, Jordan. We're going to get to Morgan in a second, all right? So Allen ultimately sets out to challenge two main arguments, and these, he argues, are the two main arguments that undermine the efforts for European American working people to struggle against white supremacy. And the two arguments are: one, that racism is innate, because if it's innate, why fight it? Two, white workers benefit, because if white workers benefit from it, why is it in their interest to oppose it, right? And that second one, he argues, comes out. The first one is Jordan, racism is innate. The second one is Morgan. Now Morgan, if you're not familiar, he writes a book, comes out around 73, 74, American Slavery, American Freedom. He's president of the Organization of American Historians, emeritus at Yale, very well-respected historian, and wrote a very important book, right? This is a very important book. But and it's the one, someone asked me about Michelle Alexander, when she does her little historical review, this is the book she cites. She's not familiar with Allen, I don't think, right? And she cites Morgan, but here's what Morgan argues in it, and this is a key thing. He argues that in the 18th century in Virginia, there were too few free, poor European Americans on hand to matter. That's the situation in St. Croix, in Jamaica, or in Barbados. But not in Virginia. You've got poor, and Allen goes through the numbers, as the Jackson, Turner, Maine, Aubrey Land, a host of historians, right? He goes through the numbers, because the implication is that there all these European Americans are being promoted to the middle class. That's not the case down south, right? All right. So Allen's arguing the white race, the ruling class social control formation, not simply as a social construct, I emphasized this before, but ruling class social control formation. Now we're ready to get into the two volumes. You with me so far? Going fast. Another 30 minutes, John. Okay, there's Allen. This is when he's close to, he publishes his books at age 75 and 78, so let us all have hope, right? There's the two volume set. And the titles, Volume 1 is Racial Oppression and Social Control. It pays particular attention to Ireland, which we're going to get into, but it's fitting for the Connolly Forum. And 2, the origin of racial oppression in Anglo-America. Allen, somebody asked about a summary. Allen himself offers a summary that's freely available online. It's in 2 parts. Each part is 50 pages long, right? But that's online on the webpage. And in the pamphlet, which is online or over there, there's a shorter summary by me of 12 pages. Also, I want to mention in this book, the new editions that came out, I did introductions, I did new greatly expanded index, back matter, and I put internal 25-page study guides in each volume, because Allen's work, again, I jokingly said this, I consider this real proletarian scholarship. It's about 800 pages, 35% of which is notes and appendices. It's really thoroughly documented. Volume 2 is particularly primary sources, 17th century Virginia. Good stuff, I think. And and in indexing, I made sure I indexed some of the footnotes, because they're stories in themselves, and some of the appendices. So Allen's work has already been described as a classic by a number of historians. People may be familiar. Audrey Smedley, you may not, if you're a historian, you might know. She's an African-American woman who wrote the American Anthropological Position on Race, in 1997. She, very well respected, very good. She wrote a book, Race in North America, and she just came when I spoke in Washington. She was at the event. Gerald Horn, Wilson Moses, people may know some of those names. Racial oppression, social control. When Allen sets out, he goes, I begin with one assumption. While some people may be desired masters, all persons are equally unwilling. He's got a basic egalitarian streak that's going to run through the whole work, right? He begins by reviewing the debate on relationship between slavery and racism, and he divides, and it's a very interesting whole entire first chapter. For the history buffs in the crowd, I recommend you read it. He goes through a lot of the writings on race and slavery, and he divides the writers into two broad categories, the psychocultural, particularly Jordan, and the socioeconomic. And he sides definitely with this group, but he thinks there's certain weaknesses in the arguments of each of them. And he's not mean-spirited when he points it out. He tries to put forth arguments in their best light and then address them. And I think this is what may appeal to people who are serious about this history. Of all the historians writing on this period, the one who he thinks gets the best overview of it is Lerone Bennett Jr. People may or may not know the name. Lerone Bennett Jr. is senior editor of Ebony magazine for many years. He wrote Before the Mayflower, which a lot of people who take black history courses are familiar with. But the book Allen cites is Bennett's The Shaping of Black America, particularly Chapter 3, The Road Not Taken. And these three prongs are similar to what Allen argues, right? Allen then goes in to look, and I'm going to do this briefly, he looks at some of the howling absurdities of race, as we define it. So he talks about colonial Hispanic America, people can purchase certificates of whiteness. In Brazil, said money whitenings, U.S. no such whitening. This one I find very instructive, 1890, siblings from British Guyana today. Portuguese immigrants settling, Portuguese going to Guyana would learn that he or she was not white. The sibling would learn that in the U.S. they were white, right? Contrast. Next one I find even more instructive. Same country, same year, Cuba, 1907. Spanish are on their way out, the U.S. is, in. In the Spanish census, Mexican Indians and Chinese were classified as white. In U.S. census, the same groups are classified as colored. We have all, and he goes through many more of these. We go through all Virginia, some of the Virginia laws, but these are just some of the torturous definitions of who's a, quote, Negro in Virginia. And, 1/4, 1/16, 1 drop, et cetera, et cetera. And now, if people are familiar with what's going on, Hispanics and Hispanics alone are allowed to define their race. People may be familiar with what's going on with the census, right? In the first face of such absurdities, Allen develops new approaches. He wants to view racial oppression as a social rather than a skin-based phenomenon, and focus not on why the bourgeoisie had recourse to slavery, but on how they could establish that degree of social control. So he decides to look in the Irish mirror. And he argues that Irish history presents a case of racial oppression without reference to skin color, or as the jargon goes, phenotype. And what he basically argues is that, and I'm doing this very briefly, and this is volume 1, a comparative study of Anglo-Norman rule and then later of Protestant ascendancy in Ireland and white supremacy in continental Anglo-America demonstrates that racial oppression is not dependent on differences of phenotype or skin color. The oppression, the nature, the characteristics of it are extremely similar, right? And he goes through cases, and documents that. He gives specific examples of what he understands as racial oppression. African Americans in the U.S., pre and post-emancipation. It doesn't end when slavery ends, right? American Indians, particularly in the 19th century, not in the early period, and we can talk about that if people want. And the Irish, especially after 1652, but particularly under Protestant ascendancy, so he argues it's a religio-racial oppression, right? He goes through some of the essential elements of discrimination, destroying original form. People are familiar in this country with this in terms of African Americans, but it's great parallels with what goes on with the Irish. Exclude the oppressed group from admittance into the forms of social identity. He goes through defining characteristics of racial oppression, declassing legislation, deprivation of civil rights, illegalization of literacy, displacement of family rights. And all I want to say, some of the discussions, those of us who had dinner earlier, we were talking about some modern day variants of these, right? He considers the hallmark of racial oppression, reduction of all members of one group, undifferentiated social status beneath others. That's that Dred Scott decision, right, that we saw. I threw this in since I'm here, but he cites Connolly, and he thinks Connolly nails what's going on when he writes with perfectly devilish ingenuity, this is writing about Ireland, the masterclass I could drive to turn the Protestant Ulster workers into allies, not of the Catholic workers, but of the exploiting class itself. And Allen comments, Connolly saw the religio-racial privileges of the Protestant workers as the ultimate frustration of Irish socialism and nationalism. But I thought it appropriate here. Allen, he offers some distinctions between what he's calling racial oppression and national oppression. And he focuses on the group in the middle, what he calls the intermediate buffer social control group. And under racial oppression, as it was constituted in the US, the buffer social control is recruited from the oppressor group. It's the European American workers, right? Under national oppression, the social control stratum is recruited from the oppressed group. A sector is promoted. You know, what we might call a national bourgeoisie later on or something like that, right? So that's how he's distinguishing. Under racial oppression in Virginia, any persons of discernible non-European ancestry were denied a role in the buffer social control. This is going back 17th century. Under national oppression in the Anglo-Caribbean, and this is where he makes important distinctions, mulattoes were included in the social control group. I'm going to give you one statistic here, we can talk about more later, but in Jamaica, on the eve of emancipation in the 1830s, out of 310,000, 70,000 enslaved or chattel bond servant Jamaicans, 70,000, 23% were owned by people of color. It's qualitatively different than what we have in the US, right? The transition. Allen is looking at this as forms of social oppression, and he recognizes that you can change from racial oppression to national oppression. It's a ruling class social control strategy, is what he's arguing. So he argues that the British West Indies and Ireland demonstrate the relativity of race as a function of social. In both cases, the colonial ruling power, faced with a combination of insurrectionary pressures, combines to resolve by decision to recruit elements of the oppressed group. So at a certain period in Irish history, he's arguing they're going to make it national oppression in Greater Ireland, maintain racial oppression in Ulster, and down in the Caribbean, it's going to turn to national oppression, and they're going to have free colors play this social control formation. So overall, and I'm going very fast, I hope you're staying with me. People all right? We okay? All right. He's arguing that the same Anglo-bourgeoisie, the same British bourgeoisie, here's what they do. They devise different systems of social control in different situations. They establish religio-racial oppression against Irish Catholics. They establish national oppression in the Anglo-Caribbean. They establish racial oppression in continental Anglo-America. That's Virginia, Maryland, that's here. They transform racial oppression into national oppression in Ireland, but they maintain racial oppression in Ulster. And then in addition, he argues, and this is a fascinating penultimate chapter in Volume 1, he talks about the Irish in New York. The Irish, victims of racial oppression in Ireland, come to New York, particularly in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, and they become supporters of racial oppression and opponents of abolition, and he describes the key factors that are involved in that. He ends Volume 1 by talking about how after emancipation and Reconstruction, the ruling class, the overall ruling class opts for white Reconstruction, and they're going to set up using the key social control techniques of the Southern system, and they're going to turn to a system of racial privileges in various ways, free land, immigration, industrial employment. That's the first volume. That's the overview of racial oppression, national oppression. Now we get into Volume 2, which he considers, he writes, it's the best of me. This is what he worked on all these years. It's based on primary sources. Another 20 minutes, and we'll have this, and then we'll get into the questions. All right. He talks about the sea change. When he talks about that sea change of the Irish in the U.S., I had one slide. He, again, puts that sea change on ruling class forces. It's not that the Irish automatically come to, turn to white supremacy and things like that, but he talks about the role of the plantation elite and related financial interests in New York. People may or may not know Fernando Wood, the mayor of New York, is a big proponent of, in support of the slaveocracy. The Catholic Church hierarchy, Irish American establishment, Catholic press, Tammany Hall. He goes through the role all of these forces play in that politicization. Here we go to Volume 2. And it's going to cover the period from 1607, the founding of Jamestown, at the 1750, we get into Georgia. I don't know if we'll do Georgia today, although it's very interesting, but we can lay it out with key events. 1622, remember that date. 1676, 7 Bacon's Rebellion, and then 1705, and again in 1723, they revised laws in Virginia. So here's what happens. Allen begins by reviewing the transition to capitalist agriculture and also in the cloth industry, right, in England. This is what Marx writes about. England is capitalist development by the founding of Jamestown, right? And that becomes important for a lot of the theories that are out there about feudalism and things like that. In England, he points out and goes into some detail describing how England attempts by legislation in 1547 to 1550 to reduce a portion of the property class to slavery. These are vagabonds, they're picking people up. They try and enslave their own people, right, in England. And this is important. Now that's beat back. There's a 1549 is Kett's Rebellion. One of the principal demands is all bondmen be made free, right? Allen, when he's doing this, is making the point that the bourgeoisie will do whatever they can get away with. They will, and he not only talks about the attempt to enslave English, he talks about the Irish slave trade in the 1650s. He talks about in Scotland from 1606 to the 1790s, the salt pan workers and coal miners being enslaved in Scotland. I mean, people are not familiar with these things. So he's not only talking about enslavement of Africans, but other people too, and he knows the ruling class will do this. Key labor law that struggled out over centuries, ultimately, and this has great bearing for what gets set up in the U.S. The key labor law in England, after Kett's Rebellion and after the attempted slavery, is the Statute of Artifices, 1563. Two key provisions: there would be no slavery of English laboring people, and wages were to be paid. This is the basic English labor law for the next 250 years. This is what those colonists come to Virginia with, right? That's the law of the land. All right. Euro-Indian relations. Allen goes through very instructive chapters and describes efforts of European powers in all of these places. I recommend it highly. And then he turns to Virginia. He notes certain characteristics of Virginia which are important. It's a continental colony, not an insular one, which makes the question of social control much more difficult because there's much vast area to escape to. There was little significant stratification, so the English, when they come, are not going to utilize the domestic labor force as the Spanish had done with the Aztecs and the Incas, and it's a low population density. So they're going to have to find some other way to get that value-producing labor, right? Key difference in the labor supply. I can't stress this enough. This is key to the race relations that develop in this country. Of all the European colonizing powers, England alone used European workers as basic plantation laborers. Spain didn't do it. Portugal didn't do it. French tried engagé labor for a short period, didn't work, right? Dutch weren't doing this, right? They weren't sending laborers. This gives a unique character to what develops. And so please remember that for the Q&A. In the course of his writings, Allen pays particular and well-needed attention to the history of African migration. Amongst one, I'm just point this out because I like to bring up some of these various aspects of what Allen does. But he makes this important point, and most people are not familiar with it: more Africans than Europeans came to the Americas between 1500 and 1800. I think that should help us understand a little better this hemisphere we live in, right? He talks throughout African migration resistance. He has great appendices on maroon societies, rebellion, resistance. From the moment of embarkation, African struggle. He pays particular attention to the Haitian Revolution, its role in emancipation of British West Indies, U.S., Cuba, and Brazil, and tying the African-American struggle in with the Latin American struggle. He pays particular attention to the fact that it's from Haiti that Simón Bolívar twice departs in his efforts, right, to end slavery and bring some liberation to Latin America. So when English colonization begins, 1607, the first permanent English settlement in America was founded. The Virginia Company Charter affirmed that all colonists, this is how Virginia set up, shall have all liberties, franchises, and immunities of free denizens of England. Go be free, right? No slavery in Virginia, right? Powhatan Indians, vicinity of Jamestown. They're well provisioned. There was just an article came out again recently in the paper within the last few days about the starving time. There was this thing about cannibalism, and I don't know if anybody saw it. But there's this period around 1609, 1610. The colonists couldn't survive without the help of the Native Americans in that early period. And the Native Americans did help. He points out in the first decade or two, the English lacked the preponderance of force that the horse-born conquistadors has brought, elsewhere in the Americas. In this early period, 1616 is when they turn to tobacco production. That's when they kind of really see what the potential is, the elite in Virginia. And over the next few years, there are efforts to bring some more intermediate forms of labor rather than just free labor. So they start bringing some convicts, some vagrants, maids for wives, women being shipped to be wives, and duty boys. That's young youth, out of the poorhouses and, reformatories. First Africans arrive in Virginia in 1619. Most people are familiar with this. They're exchanged for victuals. The colony elite, the Virginia colony elite, is telling England that there's a food shortage, but here they're trading food, right? So he thinks that really what they want to do is it's consistent with a policy of reducing labor costs. But what's important about this, amongst other things, when the first Africans arrive in 1619, whatever their status was on the high seas, they're not slaves when they're in Virginia because there's no slavery in Virginia, right? Most people say, oh, first slavery, 1619. That wasn't the case. There's no slavery in Virginia. And here's the key date, next key date, 22 March 1622. On this date, the Powhatan Indians attack the Jamestown community, right, the fort. And in one day, wipe out 1/3 of the colonists in Virginia, right? And within the next year, another third died. Now, people in this crowd are probably familiar with Naomi Klein and shock doctrine. Well, what happens is the ruling elite seizes on this opportunity, because after this attack, colonists, first off, you don't have a place to stay. You're limited to the confines of the court. The ruling elite controls the food supply and other things. They prohibit growing corn because it's a protection for Native Americans if they want to come up and attack or anything like that. So the laboring people are totally dependent on the ruling elite, the colonists in Virginia, right? So what happens is the situation for the elite embarked on a scheme whereby tenants, now let me say, 1616, the basic relations of production, if you will, the basic labor relations in Virginia were capitalist relations of production. There were free laborers or tenants at half. You worked the land, you kept half your produce, right? These are capitalist relations of production. The colony elite embarks on a scheme whereby tenants and workers were reduced to unpaid long-term bond laborers. The laboring class were dependent on the bourgeoisie. They were compelled to submit to conditions dictated by the plantation bourgeoisie. So all of a sudden, by the spring of 1622, we see new words appearing in those colonial records. Heirs and assigns. People could be assigned to somebody else. They are chattel. This is a qualitative break from English labor law. You can't buy and sell people, but this is what they're doing. And what they call it in the books, in the laws and in their records, the custom of the country. So this is not indentured servitude. This is not people willingly signing an indenture document in England, here, put me in this status. No, this is being imposed in Virginia as the custom of the country. Allen later on goes out to point out most of the chattel bond servants in 17th century Virginia, overwhelming majority were European Americans in the 17th century. They were not coming with indentures. They didn't have indentures. Later on, when some people came with indentures, they're often blank to be filled out, and then you're subject to custom of the country. You're bought and sold like chattel, right? So it's a qualitative change in labor. And by the spring of 1623, one of the officials of the colony would declare that the colony officers had all decided to reduce their tenants to servants. That's chattel bond servants. Chattel bond servitude, the custom of the country, was imposed from 1622 on. It was imposed primarily on European American workers in the beginning, right? It's a total break, a qualitative break from the statute of artificers. It is not a feudal carryover. In feudalism, there's a two-way bondage. There's duties and responsibilities on both sides. Here it's a one-way bondage. You can be bought and sold. You got no say over it. It's imposed as the custom of the country, and it's not an apprenticeship. Allen goes through this in some great detail. European chattel bond laborers, here's some of the statistics. Of 92,000 European immigrants brought to Virginia and Maryland between 1607 and 1682, over 3/4 were chattel bond laborers, the great majority of them in English. 1676, the governor of Virginia says 1,500 European chattel bond laborers arriving yearly. Such recruitment was generally coercive, right? Few were wholehearted volunteers arriving with written contracts. Many were kidnapped, some were ordinary convicts, still others were prisoners taken in rebellion. The Irish prisoners, although they sent more Irish down to the Caribbean, right? But they also, here in Virginia, people being sent under pain of death. Here's another aspect of this chattel bond servitude that's being imposed. If you're a chattel bond servant, it's going to change later when they turn to lifetime bond servitude. But in this early period, family life was prohibited. For a woman to have a child is taking time off from production, right? So marriage was incompatible with chattel bond status. The employing class outlawed sexual and family life among limited-term bond laborers. Couldn't have, any kind of family life. Fornication and adultery were punishable by fine, whipping, or 2/3 month in prison. When Allen gets into forms of resistance, and he talks about running away and, fighting and resistance, he also talks about fornication as a form of resistance, right? Women were exposed, and Allen throughout pays particular attention to this. I'm going to do this briefly here, but he talks about special laws. There were special laws because women were oftentimes a more vulnerable category. They'd have extended servitude imposed on them. Here in 1643, Virginia bond laborers first forbidden by law to marry. The offending's wife's servitude should be twice the time for which she was bound. So if a woman's bound for 4 years, 4, 5, and 6 years was common in this period, she would have to serve, if she's bound for 4, she's got to serve another 4 as a penalty, whereas a male would only get 12 months more. And there's a host of laws like this discriminating against this, and because they were prohibited from having from fornicating, laws made children of such marriages illegitimate. Allen points out in the 17th century Virginia, and this you'll also see in Morgan to some great degree, and in Lerone Bennett, the lives of African American and European bond laborers and free wage laborers, because all Africans are free wage laborers, we're going to get into African Americans in a second, were very similar up through 1676. Life expectancy in general, particularly in the early years, was very low for bond servants. But throughout this whole period, I want to stress again, the majority of the bond laborers are European American. The Royal African Company is not formed until the 1670s. So that's when there starts to be the turn towards African labor. But in this early period, the cheapest labor that they could bring into Virginia was this labor coming from England or Ireland, right? The status of African Americans throughout most of the 17th century, and this is not your Kunta Kinte version of history. We all were fed the roots phenomenon when Kunta Kinte comes on a full-blown system of racial slavery. But like everything, it has to have a beginning. It has to start, right? So in the 17th century, through most of the 17th century, throughout the 17th century, African Americans exercised marriage rights. You wouldn't see this later on, right? They exhibited social mobility. They had some significant landholding. Some were owners of European American bond laborers. They manifested many forms of resistance, running away, petitions. They could give testimony in court. They could vote. They could vote in the 1600s in Virginia, right? African Americans. 17th century, Allen argues the status of African Americans was indeterminate. It's still being struggled out, and he goes through the struggles that are going on because tobacco production is not very suitable to an efficient system of social control as in England with yeoman farmers and things like this, because it's scattered, it's dispersed, and for people to perform social control functions, it's time away from production, right? So social control is a real issue in 17th century Virginia. So he argues that the status of African Americans was being fought out. And now here's a very interesting case. And this is, please pay attention, Elizabeth Key. Elizabeth Key is a woman of European American father, African American mother. She's a limited term chattel bond servant. She thinks she's going to be, you know, she'll finish her time and she'll be free, but the people who come to hold her title to her papers want to extend her servitude to lifetime bond servitude. So Elizabeth Key petitions. That's one of the forms of resistance available in the 17th century. And she does so on 2 grounds. She goes, well, I've been baptized, and there's some history, some tradition of you're not supposed to enslave people who have been baptized. I mean, there's differing opinions, or even in the early period on those, because if the plantation bourgeoisie can get away with it, they will, right? But the second ground she argues on, and for all legal scholars here, is that in England, the common law for centuries is the status of the child follows the status of the father. Partus sequitur patrum, I'm not the Latin student, but that's it, right? And that's the law. So she's saying, well, my father's free, I should be free, right? And she prevails on both counts. You hear what I'm saying? 1656. But as they're going to turn to lifetime bond servitude, they can't, the ruling class can't have that, because then all these European American men taking advantage of these African American women, the children are going to be free. So by 1662, they changed that law. It's a qualitative change. Again, for the historians in the group, a guy named Gutman writes a book on the Negro family and slavery and freedom, but he starts in 1790. He doesn't mention Elizabeth Key, and when you have such a qualitative change, it seems like it's significant and should be discussed and analyzed. All right, so there's the Elizabeth Key case. So what Allen's arguing is the white race did not exist in this period. The attitude of laboring class European Americans stood in sharp contrast. We knew the plantation bourgeoisie is trying to extend servitude. Europeans, the Irish, they're trying to extend, they're a vulnerable group. Whoever they can get away with extending from 4, 5 to 6 and 7 years, they do, right? The plantation bourgeoisie was pressing for lifetime hereditary bond servitude for African Americans and for proscriptions on free African Americans. But Allen is emphatic. The invention of the white race at the beginning of the 18th century can in no part be ascribed to demands by European American workers that they wanted this system, right? Is this coming from up high? All right, just going on, 10 more minutes. Here's some of the numbers. 1671, 8,000 for bond laborers, 6,000 European Americans, 2,000 African Americans. Still primarily European Americans. Over the next 20 years, you get 30,000 more European Americans, 24,000 bond laborers. Even after the turn to the Royal African Company, in those first early years, you still only get 6,000 African American laborers imported. So it's still primarily European American chattel bond servants. The British finally supersede the Dutch in the trade, and that's when 1672 is the Royal African Company. Here's Bacon's Rebellion. I've gone through some of those stats about it. And Bacon's Rebellion comes after a period of 16 years of 10 laboring class and bond servant revolts, right? It's a tumultuous period in Virginia. There's a big drop in the price of tobacco on the world market in 1660. Conditions are very oppressive, and there's resistance, right? And it starts out, and we can discuss this, it starts out as the elite and the sub-elite fighting over the rate of expropriation of land from the Native Americans, but in the second Civil War stage, turns into that struggle that I described earlier. And the governor describes in 1676, 6 parts of 7 of the poor are poor, indebted, discontented, and armed. That's what they were facing, the ruling elite in Virginia, 1676. And then Allen, Grantham's Testament, which I gave you before, about the 400 English and Negroes in arms. Allen argues his testament that is beyond exaggeration. Laboring class European and African Americans fighting together, demanding their slavery. So what happens in the wake of Bacon's Rebellion? The ruling class decides on a policy to implement a new status, to contrive a new status and try and devise a means of social control. White identity, designed not only to set European American laborers and bond laborers at a distance from African American bond laborers, but to draw them in as supporters of capitalist agriculture based on chattel bond labor. And this is where that Connolly quote earlier, you know, how what they did with the Protestant, you know, in Ireland comes true. So here's some of what happens. These are some of the laws that they passed in the wake of Bacon's Rebellion. And Allen calls it a counterfeit of social mobility, because they're not being promoted out of their class. They're still laboring people, but they're being sold this bill of goods, if you will. Presumption of liberty, right to get married, right to carry a gun, right to read and write, right? All of these actually are rights in England, but they've been taken away here in Virginia, right? Right of self-directed physical mobility, male prerogatives over women. Well, that one we can talk about more. Laws against free African Americans. They also, while they're extending the privileges to the Europeans, they're imposing harsher disabilities on African Americans, and not the bond servants, they're extending their servitude and they're trying to move towards lifetime, but the free African Americans they're going after. And that's a significant factor, and Alan goes through the numbers in some of the cases and the land holding. So they start doing things, taking away rights that free African Americans had. The right to hold public office, barring any Negro from being a witness, as was Elizabeth Key in her case, right? Making any free Negro subject for lifting a hand. This becomes very important. Denial of the right to self-defense. Particularly important in terms of male supremacy, because when you take this right away, there's no defense from either the woman or the man for African American women being attacked, right? Forbidding free African Americans from possessing any gun. Forbidding European Americans to be owners of Christians, and on and on. So they start passing these laws. Then they propagandize white people, Europeans, in this white supremacy. And how do they do it? They post it on the courtroom door. They post it on the church wall, you know, and they read them to the congregation. That's the mass media of the day, and that's what they do. Parish clerks publish these laws in full to the congregants. Sheriff post on the courthouse door. The general public was regularly and systematically subject to white supremacist agitation. Very important, 1723, they pass a new law. They're codifying the laws. In 1723, they pass a law. No free Negro, mulatto, or Indian whatsoever shall have any vote in the election. Governor William Gooch, the governor of Virginia, he's asked to explain why, because even in England they don't understand this. They say, well, if these African Americans have property, why can't they vote? They didn't even understand it, right? And Gooch explains, he sets them straight. We did it to fix a perpetual brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes.
Is that the brand that came?
No, a brand, like a, you know, a brand, like a brand. You know, a brand. Here's what Alan says. Surely that was a deliberate act by the plantation bourgeoisie. That was no unthinking decision. That's the response to Winthrop Jordan, right? Here's the guy saying, we're doing it, we're putting this mark on them, right? We're putting this mark on them. It was a deliberate act by the plantation bourgeoisie, meant repealing an electoral principle over 100 years old. In that same law, denial of right of self-defense is taken away. That opens the door for all these all European American male aggression and the assumption that they could assume familiarity with any African American woman. Why the exclusion of free African Americans from these laws? It's the corollary of extending the privileges. You're taking stuff away from the African American. You're imposing harsher disabilities. This is what we see today. It's all part of what goes into this white identity thing, right? Laborers were not promoted out of their class. This is the Morgan argument. Allen cites the work of Jackson Turner Maine, Aubrey Land, some very fine historians, and he concludes about 60% of the white adult male population were not owners of bond laborers. They're thrown in direct competition, and they fare badly. I mean, they got, you know, the plantation bourgeoisie dominates Virginia. This is what happens. He emphasizes making profit and social control, and he talks about, these are the two tasks. I'm going too very quickly here, but he's always, when he's looking at the bourgeoisie, he knows the plantation bourgeoisie, they want to make money, but they've got to maintain social control. These are their two tasks. So they're constantly weighing and assessing between those two. He talks about social control in the British West Indies. It's a fascinating chapter. I'm not going to go into it now, but it's set up very differently in the Anglo-Caribbean, and he gives some reasons why. One of the most important things is it's a small island territory, and it's sugar production, which is more capital intensive. So the poor European Americans can't compete against these sugar plantations, and they're increasingly forced, either economically or by other means, off. And so then they become overwhelmingly black or people of African descent in the population. And then African Anglo-Caribbeans come to, in all the interstices, you know, they perform all these functions in the society. Allen argues the white race social control formation was invented as a social control formation whose distinguishing characteristic was participation of European laboring classes. He thinks that's the key to this white race thing, the fact that European American laborers buy into it. In time, this white race social control system begun in Virginia would serve as the model. I'm not going to do Georgia Colony, forgive me. In 1997, we can come to it if you want. In 1997, he finishes the second volume, and he writes in words that could, you know, what are we, 16 years later, they still hold true. Now, at the end of the 20th century, social gap between the Titans and the common people is perhaps at its historic maximum. Wages have tended downward for 2 decades. Entitlements and welfare as they relate to students have become obscenities. There is less of a socialist movement today than there was 100 years ago. class struggles, and epithet cast accusingly at the mildest offenders of social welfare. He saw some prospects for hope, unmistakable signs of maturing social conflict, and he did feel that America bears the indelible stamp of those struggles of the 60s, which many of us are products of, and we're still carrying on the struggle, so I think that's true. His final words, perhaps by virtue of that legacy, the renewal of the struggle of the common people, the great safety valve of white-skin privileges may finally come to be seen and rejected as the incubus, the devil, the sucking, energy-sucking devil, right? That for 3 centuries has paralyzed their will in defense of their class interests vis-a-vis the ruling class. Last 4 slides. All right, looking ahead, I think it's important. I think it's important to remember Allen's 5-stage cycle. And when he talks about, first, the lessons of the 3 previous crises, right? First, in each one of the previous crises, the ruling class turns to white supremacy. I think we have to be prepared for that. We have to know as we start to build the movement we want to build that that's what they're likely going to be turning to. Remember his suggestion that a key period is between stages 3 and 4. In stage 3, there's the overtures of unity. People start coming together, and then they try and break it by extending these privileges to the European Americans. We have to be prepared for that. We have to know what they're coming with. We struggle against white supremacy in all stages, but we got to be prepared for that. Remember Hubert Harrison about the Negro is the touchstone. Every issue we look at in society, how are black people faring, what are we going to do about it, how are we going to address that, and true democracy and equality implies a revolution startling to even think of. And remember Allen's insights, the white race was created and has been maintained as a ruling class social control formation. It serves their interest. It has been the principal historic guarantor of ruling class domination in the U.S. Efforts at radical social change in the U.S. should understand and reflect the centrality of struggle against white supremacy. Thank you.
I'm guessing you normally do that in 4 hours.
I can do it longer and I can elaborate, but we had a little intro, so we were about an hour and 10, 15. So thanks, Willie. Wow. Again, I want to encourage people, I know I went fast, but the webpage has lots of free stuff. You can pursue this. The developing conjuncture arc, if you're interested in any of this, lays it out in some detail. Alan's summary.
Let's give another hand. I took a lot of Black history courses in school, and I never heard
Harrison or Allen, I know. They're important. They're really important.
So we're gonna open up for questions and go ahead.
It seemed access to weapons was a theme frequently throughout this in terms of preventing blacks from having weapons, for example. Do you see any parallels today with the increasing government restriction on firearm access?
Yeah, I do. I mean, and it's at first African Americans, if they're free, they would have access to arms, right? But I think, I see it. I think one of the things that Alan talked about later in life, I remember talking to him about the current period, and he points out that white workers, in this class struggle, they're not going to be neutral. They're not going to be neutral, in terms of this thing. I think when we look at who's armed, who's arming, who's the backbone of this NRA movement and things like that, who did these most reactionary forces in our government, who do they still rely? I know Obama's president, but ultimately, who do they rely on? At least at this point, I don't think it's changed, for their ultimate power and to rouse things up. So I think, I think it still does. I don't think, I think we still suffer under racial oppression, and I think what Alan was pointing out, and the lessons he pointed out from those 3 previous crisis periods are true, I think, in terms of gun control, weapons, and things like that. It's like everything. It gets shaped in a very definite white supremacist fashion, right? I mean, in D.C., you're not allowed to have guns, in the black population, right? As far as I know. Certain people obviously do have guns in D.C. Right here.
Well, first I want to thank you. It's amazing.
We're from the same era, right? I saw you nod a few times.
I can't keep it all in my head, but it was really amazing. If you look at the history of colonialism, what the colonials, beginning with the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Spanish, the thing they always do is when they colonize a people, they often use the issue of skin color. Like in Haiti, they picked, the lighter skin, the more mulatto, and made them part of the ruling class. And that, so this is the nature, in a way, of the colonials as a ruling power. And it's probably, it may be more stark in the United States.
Well, if I may, that's why Alan's first volume is so important, because he uses the example of Ireland, where the skin color is the same, to show that it's not just it's not skin color. I mean, we may interpret it that way, but what they're doing, what the British are doing to the Irish Catholics is directly parallel. And then he also gets into skin color, because there's a qualitative difference in what skin color means in the Anglo-Caribbean, where there's a policy of promotion of a sector of the African-descended population, and in the U.S. as it develops, where it doesn't matter what drop, you got one drop,
Right.
you're right? So that's why part of this analysis about racial oppression, he wants to look beyond phenotype, right?
Yeah.
He wants to look at the nature of the oppression. That's
Yeah.
why I think it's very insightful, very instructive, And on the review on my page, I have reviews from Irish scholars and English scholars too. People talking about, Alan. And Alan doesn't claim to be an expert on this stuff. He draws from, what's out there. But it's enough of this theme in that history, that people can do it. And people here in this country are often struck. Gee, why didn't I ever think of that? The implications of the Irish situation.
Yeah, back to the whole gun thing. Just struck me that part of the whole hoorah of the NRA about guns in this country has to do with white male identity.
Yeah.
That you put any restrictions on guns, that's taking something away from the privileges, the
Prerogatives,
status
yeah.
of the white male.
Yeah.
I think that's good.
Clear.
Were there any parallels in Greek and Roman times where you saw this as a means of control? I've seen mixed opinions on that issue.
I don't claim to be an expert on that. I was struggling through that post office. I just don't know that history. I know what Alan writes about. I've worked with him over the years. I did some work in 17th century Virginia and on Harrison, but I've read a little, but I don't really claim to be an expert.
Well, wouldn't you say, like in European history, going back to that example, that anti-Semitism played that role of divide and conquer, so that when the workers would get restless at particular times, and the ruling class in Europe could blame the Jews,
Right.
and there would be pogroms in Eastern Europe, and so that divide and conquer mechanism has served the ruling class, I think, in Europe.
Right. I think divide and conquer does serve ruling class interests.
That's an old
But Alan's trying to get into what he understands racial oppression to be,
Yeah.
and whether, and national oppression, and he makes some important distinctions between the two. He's not lauding either type of oppression, right? He understands racial oppression is bad, national oppression is bad, but he's trying to get at the nature of it, because what he's really trying to do is get European Americans to oppose white supremacy, right? And he's trying to make the argument, this is not in our interest, if you will, or European American workers' interest. This is, it serves the ruling class. Learn the history of how it got set up from the beginning. This is how it was set up and why. So that's what he's trying to do, and he's trying to focus on the U.S. In particular. That's what he felt, his call to duty was. Yeah. Go back here. Sorry.
Yeah. According to Wikipedia, which I take with a grain of salt,
Yeah.
it says Bacon's rebellion, one of the causes was they were mad because the ruling class wasn't doing a good enough job of driving the Native American Indians out of Virginia so they could settle. Kind of like the American colonists were mad at the English because the English were dealing with the Indians, they would let them take their land. Is that true, or is what do you think?
The first stage of Bacon's rebellion, as I understand it, was a struggle between the elite and the sub-elite over the rate of expropriation of Native American lands. The elite, as is so often the case, were happy with how things were, basically, right? They're sitting pretty, right? And what's important to understand, they've already got chattel bond servitude in Virginia, and the Powhatan are not the principal labor force in that chattel bond servitude system. So what the ruling elite wants to do in Virginia in this period is maintain friendly relations with neighboring tribes who will help return runaways. They'll maybe trade, they'll do some trade with them, and things like this. But the sub-elite, of which Nathaniel Bacon Jr. was, one of the leaders, and he dies during the course of the struggle, they were interested in they were on the make, right? They wanted more land. They wanted to seize land from these neighboring tribes, which upsetting the generally comfortable relations the ruling elite had. So it starts out as a struggle between the elite and the sub-elite, basically. You with me on that? That's the argument Alan's making. But then, as so often happens in such struggles, and he talks about this, you bring other forces, into the struggle, and you expect them to fight for you, and then they start thinking about their own interests a little bit, right? And that's what happened. And the governor, that's Barclay, right? He says 6/7 of the population, poor, discontented, and armed, right? Increasingly demanding their freedom, and we see Grantham's account, right? And they're not thinking they're white, right? They're not thinking that, they're English. Right.
So, is the theory that the major exceptional piece of the United States in not forming a strong left and political parties, that it's the racial card being played?
Yeah, what Alan argues, going back, he starts arguing in the 60s. In that article when he writes about the three crises, as I said earlier, he tries to address the question of, quote, American exceptionalism, which people today use in various ways, but traditionally, and he starts talking Werner Sombart in 1906, why no socialism in the U.S. And American exceptionalism is really, in left history, the question of why does the U.S. seem to be exempt from the laws that have affected capitalism and socialist efforts elsewhere in capitalist countries. And he goes through what I described before, and I think you'd love reading it. I summarize it in that long article, but in one of the articles I linked to this, Can White Workers Radicals Be Radicalized? This is written in the 1960s. This is one of the pamphlets that influences SDS and the New Left movement so much, right? And he goes through the 6 prongs, which I gave some, free land, heterogeneity of the workforce, trade union bureaucracy, all these things. And he says these 6 prongs you'll find them, it's a composite 6 prongs, and you'll find them in Sorg, who translates capital into English, right? In Engels, so he's got no sacred cows, Alan, when he's going after this. And William Z. Forster, the head of the Communist Party, Hillman, the Perlman Commons, the labor historians, the Beards, Frederick Jackson Turner, the safety. He goes through them all and says this is their 6-prong rationale. And 2 things about it. First, it doesn't hold up. It's more myth than reality. Free land will go into the railroads and things like this. But 2, it's got to be reevaluated totally in terms of white supremacy. And then he makes the argument, looking at the 3 crises, that this is, and what he's really arguing, see, he basically, amongst other things, I would say he's arguing, if you're thinking of yourself as white, and you're functioning as white, you're serving ruling class interests. That's what this white race is about. He wants to encourage you to be a worker, to function as a worker, to do that solidarity, worker solidarity, not be white. That's the struggle, to break from this white race thing in social practice, ideologically, historical understanding, and everything. It's not been around for so long, right? And now if we got a little better idea of when it began and how it began, and whose interests it served. And that's why this notion of capitalism, and Alan goes through relations of production in Virginia, he goes through commodity production, he goes through the process of tobacco. There's not a doubt, I don't think, for anybody who reads Alan carefully, that this is capitalist production in Virginia. As a matter of fact, it's leading the nation in terms of economically, up until the 1800s, the plantation economy in the South. But it's fettered in some ways by the form of labor it has, right? Bond labor, because it's not so consistent with technology, right? amongst other things, right? And that's, you know, Marx writes about this. So, but for a while, it's functioning and functioning well. Sorry.
No, good, thank you.
Oh, right here.
Okay. Have you ever come across anyone that's studying the form of social control that's revealed in Erik Erikson's Child and Society, where he says the dominating class feel it's very important that all children should be regulated, all their impulses and instincts should be regulated from the earliest childhood for the society to work. And then we had the examples of, he's decided that the entire indigenous culture, the American Indians, had to be wiped out by the blinding light of history because they allow their children to have a strong self-will, and they had no prohibitions about their body, and they bonded with their parents. He thought that would not induce them to be functional in our culture.
I'm not so familiar with Erikson. I was a psychology major as an undergrad, but I moved away from it, actually. I'm just saying.
So is anybody working in that line?
I don't know, but I'll just say that Alan in general, and you might find interesting in that first volume over there, if you read that first chapter, when he divides the historians writing on history of racism and slavery, he divides them into two categories. The first category is psychocultural, and he's very critical of that school, so that's where Alan would be coming from on that. In terms of Native American societies or American Indian societies throughout the Americas, they're different. They vary, you know? I mean, they vary in terms of social stratification, in terms of lots of things, you know? And Alan makes that point.
Right, Erikson concentrated in the Dakota Sioux.
Huh?
Erikson concentrated in the Dakota Sioux.
Yeah, I'm just not familiar, so I'm sorry, you know, for not being
Closing up, I say two things, or split it up into two parts. First part is that I think you're quite correct when you say that and I think show very convincingly that the ruling class has utilized racism to divide the workers, to maintain their social control and their profits and so on. And indeed, that's been a function that they've carried out very successfully, not just here in terms of racism, but in Ireland in terms of religion, and on the European continent in terms of anti-Semitism, and around the world, dividing people and using that to deflect attention from who's running things and who is serving people who do run things. The second point, though, I want to make is that it seems to me you're dismissing people like Jordan and others who point to the pre-existence of racism prior to the Virginia colony and prior to Bacon's rebellion and so on. Because Jordan, for example, and others too, have turned up evidence that the Europeans of the time, particularly northern Europeans, like the British, did show shock and bewilderment and at times horror at the darker skinned peoples that they were discovering in Africa and elsewhere. And it was that pre-existence of the sense of difference from people of darker skins that could then be played on, that could be utilized by the ruling class to divide the workers and to create situations where they could maintain their supremacy. So it seems to me you can have both. You can have both the ruling class plan and practice, and you can have, in some degree, among the masses, among the workers, sadly, that they're divided from those darker skinned peoples, that those darker skinned peoples are different, and thus that fear can be played on.
Two things. Alan actually discusses this, and I encourage you to read Volume 1, Chapter 1, because he discusses, I mean, Jordan is the main thing he's going after. He thinks this is the one you got to deal with, right? He goes through English examples, and he cites, because he's very even-handed, he cites examples where Jordan cites this, and you know, Shakespeare, you know, this, but he'll find comments on the other perspective too, awe and admiration you know, for African peoples and things like this. So he's very, you know, you see both. And ultimately what Alan's saying is, first off, he's saying these notions, I threw one slide up there, he says these notions of superiority, inferiority, or whatever, are not coming from the laboring people. It's the ruling elite that's pushing this stuff. And he's arguing that there are differences of opinion. Francis Drake gives very favorable comments on African peoples. You know, and he wants to ally with the Cimarrons down in Panama, you know, because they're good, trusted fighters and things like this. So, you know, he'll use those examples, but what Alan says is, it ultimately comes down to not what you think about me or what I think about you, but what are you able to implement and do, right? And that's where he gets into how the ruling class is doing, because first off, he's arguing those sentiments that you're describing, there are alternate sentiments, one. Two, they're not amongst working people, you know. One or two little instances he finds, he says, here, this is all I can find in 1,400 things, you know, which is probably about par for any group or any person looking at anyone else. And so I think he tries to address that fairly, and I think, particularly somebody who's well-versed in this, I think you would enjoy, you'd appreciate Alan's, because he's not mean towards Jordan, and Degler too. He goes through their arguments in some depth. You know.
If Africans in 1619, or originally, that's the beginning of the onslaught,
The onslaught.
the onslaught, yeah, right, their imprisonment practically on slave ships out of Africa, arriving here, and yet we start talking about them in the 1660s when we start seeing them being denied.
Not we.
I'm sorry?
Not we. I know. I was.
Well,
you know, the people who are making those laws.
The ruling
in Virginia.
class starts denying them certain quote-unquote privileges. What is their status between 1619 and the 1660s then? They arrive as quote-unquote slaves.
No, they don't arrive as slaves because there's no slavery in Virginia. And when Yardley, the colony secretary, purchases...
But they're brought against their will.
Huh?
They are brought against their will.
Whatever their status on the high seas, but you have to realize that 3/4 of the colonists brought to Virginia are being kidnapped, you know, all of this. I mean, it's not like people are willingly coming here.
But it's against their will on the ships.
On the ship, but when they come here, there is no slavery, so their status, it's not clear.
But are they owned?
No, they're what I believe happens.
Well, what's the transaction that takes place?
I think they become servants of the colony. Servants is a status where people are serving 4, 5, or 6 years, not as chattel, not as somebody who can be bought and sold. You serve 4, 5, and 6 years. Europeans are doing this too, and then you get access to land. Alan goes through people, a fellow named Anthony Johnson. You can read about him. He goes through Anthony Johnson's accumulation of land.
So their original status is one of almost indenture.
No, well, it's not clear.
Not clear.
It's not clear. The records are just not.
4 or 5 years implies indenture.
Well, I'm saying that could have been if there's it's not clear. We don't have any records of those 20 and odd who come in 1619.
Okay.
We have no record of what their status is within the next year
And
or
those
anything like that.
things that they're. Go ahead.
But to go on, some are free wage laborers, some are tenants. Some after the chattelization are chattel bond servants. Some own land, they're property owners. This is what Alan goes, he does a whole chapter on the status of African Americans in the 17th century, in the 1600s, and basically says it's indeterminate. Yeah, certainly there are probably many who are chattel bond servants, but the majority of the English are bond servants, you know?
So do they own property?
Yes, some African Americans do, and he goes through these.
Slaves too.
Some bold examples, staggering examples. Anthony Johnson is one name, but he cites others there, you know.
And by the 1660s, this is the period when they start to be subjected to total slavery.
No, it's still not. There's efforts to extend servitude, but there's also efforts to extend servitude on the Irish in this period. 1655 is the period, you know, it's referred to as the period of the Irish slave trade. And the Irish are coming, and people are coming, and whenever there's a vulnerable group, if they can, they seek to extend it a little. Now, Africans probably in some ways are more vulnerable than others because at least the Irish potentially have ties to Catholic powers, you know, and things like that. Africans perhaps less so. But I don't think you want to, it looks like you're just looking for the hook, why Africans should be treated differently, and that's not what was necessarily going on. The status was much more of commonality of experience. It wasn't good. These were tough conditions for everybody. But the people at the bottom, I didn't emphasize it, but as Alan points out, as Lerone Bennett Jr. points out, African Americans and European American laboring people in this period did what normal human beings would do. They fought together, they resisted together, they made love together, they functioned as normal human beings, right? They weren't white.
Right.
Okay. Just one more burning question?
Is there okay?
You're go ahead.
Was there anybody else? Is there somebody, don't let somebody else go before me.
Just one more question, I think, Willie.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that in the mid-1600s, the English ruling class was like really brutal bastards. I mean, they were willing to enslave anybody. And it didn't matter what color they were, because they were kidnapping thousands and thousands of Irish people and bringing them to Barbados.
Exactly.
And, you know, and they were just experimenting, and they were out on the high seas for the first time, just conquering much of the world, and conquering one island after another, and just seeing what could work here and what could work there. And they just really experimented a lot.
Just in response to that, in volume 2, Alan does a wonderful chapter, which, since you're familiar with this, I think you'd particularly appreciate, on the abortion of the white race attempt in the Anglo-Caribbean, why it didn't work down there and why they turned to this national oppression type thing where they use, and he goes in great detail in Barbados and Jamaica. So I think you'd appreciate that. Yeah, that's in volume 2.
Especially Barbados. The
Yeah.
history of Barbados
Right.
in the mid-1600s is unbelievable.
Yeah, and he cites some good examples, again, which you may be familiar with or maybe not.
Last question.
Okay, I really, in a way, pose this for all of us. And the Achilles heel, I think, of the labor movement in the United States and the left has been white skin privilege and racism.
Where have you been? This is
And we just, and to me, you know, somebody who's been an activist since I was pretty young, I've seen us go through periods where it was really struggled and tried to address, and I just haven't seen that in a very long time. So if you have any ending comments on this.
Yeah, one thing, I do. I worked for 33 years in the labor movement, right? I was a postal worker. I come out of the big 4,000 worker postal facility in Jersey City. I worked at all levels. We struck against the federal government. We had several hundred people fired, 2 years by PATCO under Jimmy Carter, the Democrat, you know, so it's not only, the assault doesn't just start with Reagan, right? And our union was mob control, laborers, you know, federal postal workers, you know, in the federal sector, they let the organized crime come in, struggled all those things. You know, I've been involved in a lot of struggles. On my webpage, front page, got the third article down in the left, I describe some of the work we carried on in the postal office, in the postal unions, where we tried to implement struggle, putting the struggle against white supremacy as central. Every issue. We would come out, payday was Thursdays, every 2 weeks. So we put out our bulletin on Thursday because we know we get the most readers, right? You put out the bulletin on Thursdays. And it's not hard finding issues to talk about, and it's not finding issues where white supremacy is shaping. So whether we're talking about discipline in the black worker for the same offense as the white is getting twice the disciplining, or the denial of light duty to African American women who are pregnant, although we're supposed to have a, you know, no layoff clause and things like this, on and on. You know, we had issues constantly, and we did this in Jersey City. Now, if people are familiar with Jersey City, it's a little bit like parts of Brooklyn, you know, and very racially polarized, and Bayonne, you know, and we did this there, and at the high point of some of our activity in the 80s, we had 3 out of 4,000 workers wearing anti-apartheid buttons in a workplace that's 75% European Americans. Still, I mean, the percentages were changing. But let me just say a little more. On the Postal Service, which I'm familiar with, if I may, the Postal Service, 1970, there's big post office strikes, keyed in the inner cities of New York and Chicago. rank and file, and Mo Biller and, you know, and some of these other labor leaders tried to ride the crest and say they were the leaders. They weren't, right? It sprung, particularly from the rank and file, letter carriers and clerks particularly, New York and Chicago, where the workforce was 75% black and Latin in New York and maybe 80% in Chicago. These are products of the 60s and the militancy of that period. You have black workers traditionally had been a relatively high employment in the post office because you took a test, so there was some measure of objectivity, and if you got in, there was a no layoff clause, so you had some chance of staying. But you had the increase in Latin workers, you had the increase in women workers coming in the 60s, right? These struggles are key. So when Nixon's the president, and when there's that postal strike in 1970, he catches hell because Business Week does 28 pages because Wall Street ran on paper and they couldn't get their paper and the National Guard couldn't process the mail. So they pass a Postal Reorganization Act, and this is what they do. First, they decide to recognize certain unions and not recognize others. One bargaining unit that they refuse to recognize, National Alliance of Postal and Federal Employees, which is set up in 1913 after Woodrow Wilson segregates the federal sectors, the federal workplace, post office, Department of Treasury, Bureau and Engraving, various places, segregates them, right? And they bring in LIUNA, organized crime, one of the 4 big organized crime unions, which is my parent union, right? And they bring them in to the Postal Service. Why? Because they take control over the health plan, the Federal Employees Health Benefit Plan. I can talk about a lot of this stuff with people because I had to write under pseudonyms, you know, exposing this stuff. But they do a few other things. They turn to a whiter workforce. As I said, New York and Chicago, 75–80% is the makeup of the workforce. They turn to a hub and spoke system like the airlines, where they build bulk mail centers. 21 of them nationwide. Ours is called New York International Bulk Mail Center. It's 10 miles from Harlem, 12 miles from Newark, 14 miles from Bed-Stuy, but instead of 70–75% black and Latin, it's 20% when because there's no public transportation in Jersey. Chicago, with 80–85%, they put it in Cicero or Cairo, one of these places, 10%, the Klan marches openly, right? And it's a conscious turn to a whiter workforce. And you go back and you read in the congressional record, and they're talking about, we gotta go get those type workers we used to have, you know? I mean, this is, you know, it's code words like they use all the time. So there's these policies, but in terms of the work, I think the example from, and it's in this Troublemaker's Handbook that somebody had in their car earlier, you have it in your car, that was put out. I have an article there from a labor notes talk where I gave one of these talks too, but it talks concretely how I think it's possible to put the struggle against white supremacy as central, to have good, positive results, to build a type of movement. What happens when the way, and this is probably like a lot of workplaces, you're in a workplace, and there's supposed to be some system for rotation of overtime, you know, who gets overtime, it's money in people's pocket, right? But it would often be just doled out in very white supremacist fashion, right? And so the union, we come in and we say, no, we're not playing that anymore, you know, we're going by the rules. And people are ready to come to blows at first, right? Some of the white workers, because you're taking money out of their pocket. And other workers are scared around, is this for real? How long is this going to last and stuff? But if you show that you're really going to try and fight the good fight, people come to respect that. We paid particular attention to the makeup in terms of race, if you will, race and gender in terms of our committees. We had committees in every area, you know, light duty, safety, contract, you know, all these different areas. And we did what I think you're supposed to do in workplaces. And we mapped the place, it's 4,000 workers, and we went after it. And we really struggled for control, which is what you should do. And then we took it to the national and local levels, you know, we waged good struggle. But I think it's possible, and I think it's the kind of labor movement we want to build, you know, with that type of unity. But that's practical, I think, so I don't just do the history. Sorry, John.
Right. www.jeffreydperry.net. Remember that. And again, I think this discussion and struggle that we just had here, this is to be continued. And I also want to thank John, and if you have a committee, for giving me the opportunity to chair this meeting tonight. Right? And I hope that in the future that we make this a landmark, that it be so many people coming in this door that, you know, if first come, first serve, you don't get here, you won't get in.